He was the heartbeat of the greatest band in history, the steady, smiling man who made the others soar. But behind the gentle eyes of Ringo Starr lay decades of insecurity, dismissal, and the chilling memory of betrayal. Ringo didn't walk into the Beatles as a fourth brother. He walked in as the replacement everyone thought was disposable. He was mocked in headlines as the luckiest drummer alive, and insiders constantly questioned whether he truly belonged. This feeling, that he was optional, led to three defining conflicts that scarred his time in the band and left him with resentments he carried for decades. There was Paul McCartney, the workaholic who pushed him aside and treated him like a piece of equipment, taking his seat to prove he was better. There was John Lennon, the leader Ringo admired, who slowly disappeared, choosing a new loyalty that left no oxygen for their brotherhood. But then there was the calculating outsider, the business tyrant who turned a musical family into courtroom enemies. Only one of these men represented the deepest betrayal, ensuring the band would never stand on a stage together again. The story of Ringo Starr is not about luck. It is about precision, feel, and endurance in the face of constant humiliation. Now, after decades, the full picture reveals the names Ringo could never forgive, and the one person he truly hated more than anyone. To understand the depth of that hatred, we must begin where Ringo's insecurity was born, in the unforgiving chaos of their first hit. Top 3. George Martin and the disposable drummer stigma. Ringo's journey into the Beatles was shadowed by a single, crippling thought: I am the replacement. This insecurity didn't start with band arguments. It started with his childhood, marked by years lost to illness, first peritonitis, then tuberculosis, and coming out of the hospital quiet, shy, and constantly feeling like everyone else knew more than he did. When the Beatles needed a stronger drummer than Pete Best in 1962, Ringo walked into EMI as the supposed upgrade. Within days, he was publicly and professionally humiliated. The song was Love Me Do, and the producer in the room was George Martin. Despite Ringo being the new, essential member, Martin was not convinced he was good enough. So, quietly, the adults in the room replaced him on the single, bringing in session drummer Andy White. For Ringo, this was the first crack, the absolute confirmation that he was disposable. Decades later, the sting of that moment never faded. The drummer who was supposed to be the savior was instantly and silently replaced on their first major hit. The press immediately seized on the narrative. Headlines joked Ringo could only keep time. Critics called him the least talented Beatle, insisting he was lucky just to stand behind Lennon and McCartney. The message was clear: your first big hit, and the story is you're only here because of your friends. This stigma, that he was the one with the shortest resume, the lucky one, the least talented, would hang over Ringo for his entire tenure. While Ringo later achieved a reconciliation with George Martin, even making him apologize every day for the slight, Martin's initial doubt permanently solidified Ringo's role in the band's obvious hierarchy. John and Paul were the writers, George was the frustrated third genius, and Ringo was the one who sang the novelty songs, played the steady beats, and made people laugh, nothing more. It was a feeling of being constantly undervalued that made him vulnerable to the next conflict, a conflict that was far more personal and painful, coming from the one bandmate who consistently tested his patience. Top 2. Paul McCartney, the perfectionist who stole his seat. If George Martin created Ringo's professional stigma, it was Paul McCartney who constantly triggered the personal wound. Paul was the workaholic, the relentless organizer who stepped into the leadership vacuum after the death of Brian Epstein in 1967. While admirable in principle, he was the one who consistently pushed the Beatles back into the studio when they were drifting. This energy translated inside the band as pure control. Paul wasn't just writing songs. He was telling people exactly how to play them. For Ringo, who valued peace and stability more than anything, this constant needling felt like disrespect. Ringo summed it up brutally simply: Paul always made the phone call. Paul would want us to work all the time because he's the workaholic. But the breaking point, the moment that confirmed Ringo's worst fears, occurred during the notoriously fractious White Album sessions in 1968. Paul, obsessing over tiny, minute details, repeatedly made Ringo redo a simple drum pattern again and again. The frustration peaked when McCartney, instead of simply explaining what he wanted, walked over to Ringo's kit, sat down, and demonstrated exactly how the part should be played. For a drummer who already carried the stigma of being the replacement and the least talented, having a bandmate, especially the workaholic leader, literally take his seat was more than a correction. It was confirmation. You're optional. Ringo, feeling like a piece of equipment rather than a partner, quietly walked out. He left the band and disappeared for about 2 weeks while the other three struggled on without him. The pain was rooted in a question. If Paul didn't trust his drumming, what was he even doing there? Paul's perfectionism certainly kept the Beatles' standards sky high, but for Ringo, it made him feel like a session musician on his own record. Watching Paul play his drums was the trauma of the Love Me Do replacement playing out in real time. Yet, the complicated nature of this conflict is reflected in their later lives. These two men eventually became each other's last link to the band. Paul personally inducted Ringo into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist in 2015. They have toured, shared the stage, and McCartney has publicly called their bond very special. The personal, creative tension was ultimately resolved through shared history and love. But Ringo's sense of betrayal would be transferred to a new, more unsettling figure. His lifelong friend and leader, John Lennon. Top 1. Alan Klein, the betrayal that ended a brotherhood. While Paul's actions were born of professional perfectionism, the betrayal from the man Ringo came to hate most was cold, calculating, and ultimately financially ruinous. But before we get to the man who shattered the brotherhood, we must acknowledge the moment Ringo realized his leader John Lennon was gone. Ringo always admired John. For years, John had been the anchor of the band. Ringo stood behind him like a steady shadow, even when the others argued. But in 1968, everything shifted. When Yoko Ono appeared, she didn't just appear beside John. She appeared in the studio, in the creative process, and in the unspoken hierarchy. The closed circle of 4 voices suddenly became 5 presences, and John's loyalty shifted instantly. The atmosphere grew strange during recording sessions. Yoko would interrupt with suggestions, and when George Harrison snapped in frustration, John exploded, slamming a table and defending her, accusing his bandmates of disrespect. John even looked at Ringo and said bluntly, "Just keep it even, that's enough." The message to Ringo, the least talented one, was devastating. Your opinion ends where her opinion begins. John's emotional withdrawal meant the Beatles were losing their leader because of an all-consuming relationship that left no oxygen for anyone else. This betrayal was profound, causing Ringo immense emotional cost. But it was not the deepest betrayal. The deepest betrayal came from the man Ringo mistakenly trusted to fix the chaos, Alan Klein. The band was drowning in chaos after Brian Epstein's death, unable to balance their books. Ringo, tired of polite but ineffective executives, found Alan Klein refreshing, blunt, aggressive, and willing to fight. Klein promised to protect them. John was the first to embrace him, George quickly followed, and Ringo, desperately wanting stability, signed on too. Ringo later explained his appeal. Klein was a hustler, and I felt it was time I had someone hustling for me. But Klein was a strategist who knew how to weaponize loyalty. He studied every fracture: Paul's need for control, John's restlessness, George's resentment, and Ringo's desire for peace. He exploited them, turning arguments into battlegrounds. When Paul refused to sign a contract with Klein, Klein encouraged John, George, and Ringo to move forward anyway. This resulted in Paul suing the other 3 Beatles and Klein in 1970. The lawsuit legally shattered any remaining friendship. The brotherhood was destroyed not just by egos, but by signatures and courtrooms engineered by Klein. Then came the cruel twist of fate. By 1973, Ringo, along with John and George, realized the man they trusted had mismanaged funds, manipulated contracts, and used the Beatles for personal leverage. Klein was fired, and all 3 who had sided with him admitted they were wrong. The devastation was summarized by a quote, later revealed by Alan Steckler. "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there. I'm ready. So is Ringo." For Ringo, the betrayal by Paul was professional frustration, and the hurt from John was emotional drift. But Alan Klein represented the absolute deepest betrayal of trust. The man he trusted to protect the band became the man who ensured they would never stand on a stage together again. That realization, that he had allowed an outsider to legally and emotionally destroy the most important friendship in his life, and that the man was a swindler, is why Alan Klein holds the undisputed title for the person Ringo Starr truly hated more than anyone else. When the dust from the Alan Klein lawsuits finally settled, Ringo Starr was left facing a brutal, public question. Was he really the least talented Beatle, as the headlines joked? For years, that narrative of being the man carried by Lennon and McCartney echoed louder than ever, because there was no band left to hide behind. But time, the greatest critic, exposed the truth the others missed. The same producers who questioned Ringo realized he was the only Beatle who almost never drifted off tempo. George Martin, the man who once replaced him, later admitted Ringo wasn't just reliable, he was the click track, the human anchor holding the band together. Younger drummers studying his parts realized they couldn't copy his unique feel. He was rock solid. Ringo's legacy is not one of luck or simplicity. It is one of precision, feel, and endurance. He wasn't the least talented Beatle. He was the heartbeat, the steady foundation that let the other three soar. He was the piece no one realized they needed until he proved it for half a century. While Ringo endured the professional humiliation from George Martin and the personal disrespect from Paul McCartney conflicts, which were ultimately reconciled, most notably in his ongoing bond with Paul, the hatred reserved for Alan Klein was unique. It was the hatred of a man who realized he had been manipulated into destroying his own family. The emotional drift with John Lennon was tragically unresolved in 1980, but the betrayal by the hired outsider who leveraged Ringo's desperate desire for stability remains the most devastating scar. The hatred Ringo held for Klein was a hatred born of betrayal, proving that sometimes the greatest threats to a brotherhood don't come from within, but from the person you mistakenly hire to protect you. If you were shocked by the depth of Alan Klein's manipulation, or if you want more brutally honest, behind-the-scenes stories like this about rock legends and the awkward moments hiding behind their smiling faces. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Behind the Lights. There are a lot more secrets still hiding behind those iconic stages.